Oh, yeah, good day. And hello to you. Just watching some Stevie Ray Vaughan. Yeah, Stevie Ray Vaughan, an amazing, to put it mildly, American blues rock guitarist. He was the most amazing guitarist. He also had a terrible drug addiction for a long time. He used to mix cocaine and whiskey in his drinks. But he became sober, and the last 3 years of his life, I say the last 3 years of his life, were spent ripping it up, playing a song like that called Tightrope, a blues based song that's rock. And yeah, he perished in a really awful, horrific helicopter crash. That was Stevie Ray Vaughan. It's just amazing to me that I can pull up his music, which I'm doing because I'm reading a book on him, or I just finished reading a book on him. I read rock autobiographies, and Stevie Ray Vaughan was a very interesting guy that I decided to take a liking to, and I can go find his music online, even though he's not living anymore, and I can find it for free. I can find it on YouTube. And that's introducing our subject for today. It's about how sound and audio and radio, three terms that are very related, have been transformed from the very early beginnings in the way that sound was created and into music today that you can go fetch on your computer screen. And so we're going to take on chapter 6 today. We're taking on audio, as it's called, which includes talk, it includes music, it includes a lot of different technologies that we're going to talk about. I got a lot of links for you today you can check out in the email. But before I get to all of that, let's just touch base as a class. It's our second week of class. And I want to let you know that there's still time, if you haven't got off to the best start, to get things going again. First of all, you don't want to be throwing away points with RSC posts. If you're not doing your RSC posts every day, 5 per week, right? You're throwing away points. Why would you not claim those points? And then you get to the end of the class and you're missing points and you're in the C range or the D range or the B range instead of the next one up. Don't throw away points with your RSC posts. Secondly, remember that you need to be reading the chapter and watching the instructor videos in order for you to see the quizzes. If you're not seeing a quiz, you're basically saying that you didn't come to class because you didn't watch the instructor video, but you still want to take the quiz. And that's not the way that this course works. You have to watch the instructor video, which then triggers the quiz. And I also want to mention that Samantha Avalos is somebody you should really think about visiting. She's a tutor for the class. She's great to talk to. She took this class before, worked really hard, and it got off to a tough first start to it. But she came back just fine, and so can you. And I am going to be looking at people who have attended the tutoring sessions at the end of the course. She takes attendance. And if there's a borderline situation between a B minus, for example, and a C plus, those tutoring attendance sessions are going to make the difference in your grade. Above and beyond that, she's just a person you can have a conversation with, and in so doing, you're actually also learning the material. So Samantha's Zoom link is there for you on the D2L homepage. She's there every day for you from 5 to 6. You can drop in for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, a whole hour. Drop in and see Samantha. All right, let's turn our attention now to the chapter material. And everybody has their favorite music, right? Music is so inspirational. We use it for all kinds of situations in life. I'm listening to Stevie Ray Vaughan. Many of you are listening to your own favorite artists. And the book chapter starts out with Kendrick Lamar and how he actually won a Pulitzer Award. And so music has a strong prominence in most people's lives. But let's talk about the history of it so we can see from where it came. So we're going to delve into the history of sound recording. And before we do that, let's just mention what things were like before we had sound recording. Before we had sound recording equipment, if you wanted to listen to music, it had to be by a live performer. That means you had to have a piano in your house, or you had to have a guitar or a flute, and the person would perform. And then if you saw them perform the next day, they didn't perform exactly the same song. They played it a little bit differently, a little bit different pace, a little bit different tone. And when they were gone, you had no music. You had no way to carry it around. That's how music was. It was live. It was performances. And so for people to be able to play music and learn music, music was recorded, not in terms of like audio recording, but it was recorded in terms of written sheets of paper, sheet music, the notes of music. Anybody who's ever taken a music class or played an instrument, you know what I'm talking about. So when did all of this change? It all changed with an inventor who we're going to be highlighting for a few classes now. You know him. His name is Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison in 1877 invented what he called a phonograph. a phonograph. It was the first method for storing music. The phonograph was a long cylinder with a needle that went on top, and the needle picked up the magnetic frequencies, which were changed into electrical impulses, and they played back music. You can see a link for that in the email. But Thomas Edison's phonograph was not intended to be used for music at all. He thought it was going to be a dictation machine, like when you're in court and trying to type down depositions. That's how he thought it was going to be used for. The very first song, though, that was used on this recording medium was Mary Had a Little Lamb. Mary Had a Little Lamb, and that song became the very first recorded song. And that was a profound change in music, because now music could be stored and carried to other places, and people could hear the same version of a song. And so music starts to enter the mass communication phase because of Thomas Edison's invention, which was not just done in the backyard one night. It took him like 10 months to come up for this invention. Well, along comes another inventor who improved this invention. His name was Emil Berliner. He was from Germany. Emil Berliner, you can get his spelling of his name from the chapter textbook, and he invented something called a gramophone. And instead of using a cylinder to store music like Edison, Berliner used a flat disc. Originally made out of zinc was the material. And the disc is looking very much like an LP today, or what you guys call vinyl. It's sort of the forerunner of vinyl. And this is the new way, a better way to store music. Other technologies came along after that, and notably in 1935, we get hi-fi. You know, we have Wi-Fi today, which is supposed to be wireless fidelity. There's no such thing, but that's where that term is borrowing from. It's borrowing from hi-fi, which stood for high fidelity. And basically what that involved was a new recording technique that made it possible for music to have higher highs and lower lows when you play the music back. And so what this method of recording, hi-fi did, and playback did, is it really expanded the song and made it much richer and much more robust, much more whole when you listen to music, much more pleasant to listen to, hi-fi. Along comes other technologies for storing music. We get the LP, which has made a comeback in the form of vinyl. It's got two sides to it, right? It's made out of vinyl. It's a disc. You play it on a turntable. We also had for a brief time 45s. 45 refers to the speed at which the turntable is rotating. 45 revolutions per minute. That was a smaller LP that was very popular. You could find those on jukeboxes and in bars and restaurants across the U.S. when the 45 was the king of the sound storage medium. And then eventually later in 1982, we get the CD, which today is old school as well. The CD is the way for you to store music digitally for the first time, storing music in terms of ones and zeros. And the CD was invented by a Dutchman named Klaus Compan, and he actually was working on it in the 1960s, Klaus was, but it wasn't until 1982 that it came out. It was resisted by record companies because record companies thought, when that CD comes out, everybody's going to steal music. It's going to be so easy to copy a CD and just give your friend the music, and that is kind of what happened. And then eventually we go to the MP3. The MP3 is a way of storing music into a file. It's a file extension. That's what MP3 is standing for. And that made music streamable. It made it possible to put it up there in the cloud or to keep it on your phone or in your computer. That's where music is now. So music has come so far from those early beginnings of music where you had to be in the same room as a piano player in order to hear it. Let's move on now to radio, because radio grows up as an industry because of sound recording. So we're going to talk about one of the most, I think, important things that you can learn from this class, and that is before electronic communication, before radio, which we're going to talk about momentarily, and then later television and the internet, before that kind of communication, even for printed materials like books and magazines, before electronic communication, communication had to be transported. You got that? It had to be transported. You had to carry it. You write a letter, you have to carry it. You've printed a newspaper, you have to put it in a truck and take it somewhere. You've written a billboard, you have to go carry it and put it up on top of a tower. But after electronic communication no longer had to be transported, carried somewhere. It could be transmitted. could be transmitted through electrical impulses. And it all started with the invention of the telegraph. You've got a link for you there in today's email to show you how the telegraph worked. It's that dee 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 dee. It looks like a stapler. Dee 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 dee. The telegraph was a way for people to communicate over phone lines, but they used Morse code. Morse code was a dot and dash system. D is a dot, D is a dash. D, 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 D. You have a whole alphabet for that. It's developed by Samuel Morse, who was in the Army, and there was no way to carry voice on phone lines at that time, so that's why they used the telegraph, but it made communication instantaneous. And the kinds of applications that kind of communication was used for were mostly railroad situations, like a train's leaving from Los Angeles, and then they telegraph up to San Francisco and saying, it's on its way, the train is going to be there by 3 o'clock. But the telegraph gave the idea that communication could take place across vast expanses without two people being in the same space. You can actually communicate from Los Angeles to San Francisco, even though there are lots of mountains and lots of other obstacles in the way, because electronic communication does not require transportation, does not involve carrying it. So the next step in the development of radio, excuse me, comes from another inventor. His name is Heinrich Hertz. Heinrich Hertz, Hertz, just like the car rental company. And in fact, today, if you know electronics, you know that the unit of measurement for electronics is gigahertz and megahertz. That's where it comes from. Heinrich Hertz, he developed, get this, just a theory of radio, just a theory. He didn't have any components or parts. He developed a theory that you could actually transmit through the airways information. So he drew up all his theories on the board, and then along comes another inventor who puts those theories into practice, and his name, an Italian inventor, was Guglielmo Marconi. Guglielmo Marconi, he created the very first radio, but they called it a wireless telegraph. A wireless telegraph because he created the ability to transmit through the air using Heinrich Hertz's theories. He developed the ability to transmit Morse code. So now Morse code didn't need wires. It could go over the airway, another transformative development in the development of radio. And Guglielmo Marconi did the first overseas radio transmission. He broadcast all the way from England to Northern Canada, in Newfoundland. So with his dee all the way across the ocean, I mean, doesn't seem like a big deal today, but that was absolutely transformative when he developed that in 1894. Along comes another inventor I want to highlight now. His name is Reginald Fessenden. Reginald Fessenden, in 1901, he was a physicist, and in that year, 1901, he developed the ability to send voice over the airways. So now, because of Fessenden's invention, we finally have all the components for radio to come into place. And one of the very big names in early radio history is David Sarnoff. David Sarnoff, Sarnoff, he kind of became famous for a different reason. He was a person operating a radio receiver in New York when the Titanic sank, and he was the one who was calling out the names of the people who had been found, who had perished, who needed medical attention when they got back to the dock. But then he also went to work for the Marconi Company. Guglielmo Marconi, started a whole radio company making radio appliances, as they called it back then. And David Sarnoff was working for that company, and he had a vision. He had a vision that he put into a memo, and it's a famous memo in the history of radio now. It's called the Radio Music Box Memo. Radio Music Box Memo, and he said that we could make radio, quote, a household utility. A household utility where you have this box that's inside, and that box is like a jukebox that can play music. I mean, think about how fundamentally transformative that must have been to have the idea of a box that can play music, when before you want music, you have to listen to somebody playing the piano in your living room. So his idea really took radio into a new arena. It wasn't going to be used by the Navy so much anymore, as it was going to be a medium of entertainment for people in people's houses, and it was going to be seen as a utility, much like electricity comes into your house, much like water comes into your house. That's what David Sarnoff developed vision-wise. All right, so now let's move on to the RCA monopoly. Many of you in this class will have an RCA television in your house. That company is still around. It stands for Radio Corporation of America. And the reason that this company was formed was because in World War II, the Navy took control of all the radio technology patents because they could be used by the enemy. I mean, radio was used by the enemy to discover your enemy's positions, to listen to their commands, to find out how they're strategizing. Radio could be used by the enemy. So the Navy took all those patents. But then after that period, RCA was created so that the government would not control radio. So RCA took control of those patents so that we didn't have it in the hands of government. And RCA itself was formed out of several companies, really unusual collection of companies here. RCA was formed out of General Electric, which is GE. It was formed out of AT&T, which many of you have as a cell phone provider today, and you don't maybe even know what the name of that company stands for, American Telegraph and Telephone Company. That's AT&T. RCA was formed out of GE, AT&T, Westinghouse, which made refrigerators for railroad cars and then appliances in the home. And then the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company had banana plantations all over the world. And when people would go ashore to the plantation, they wanted to use radio to communicate with those boats while they were going into Panama or into Costa Rica or wherever the bananas were being grown. So this big company was really proliferating and pushing forward the technology of radio. The actual very first radio broadcast took place in Pennsylvania, took place in Pittsburgh, a radio station called KDKA, an AM radio station, which I visited as part of my doctoral dissertation, gathered my data to write that for my Ph.D. KDK, the very first radio station in Pennsylvania and the United States, it was broadcasting the election returns for a presidential election between Cox and Harding in 1920. So we get the very first radio station. And after the possibility, people seeing the possibility of what you can do with radio, now all of a sudden, radio just explodes. Radio stations are formed, and eventually networks are formed. RCA formed the very first network. What a network is a collection of radio stations that are fed programming from a single source. A studio, like the NBC studio is in Times Square, and NBC sends out TV programming to NBC affiliates. Same thing with radio. It was an affiliate. And in fact, NBC was the company that RCA founded. And RCA founded the NBC network. And NBC used to have the blue network and the red network. And you can look at the link in the email I've sent to show you where those networks are, basically stretching across the East Coast, across to the West Coast in California. But NBC became so powerful that the government said you have to sell off one of these networks because you're looking too much like a monopoly. And so NBC sold off one of those networks, and it became the ABC radio network. NBC is National Broadcasting Company. ABC is American Broadcast Company. Both of them still exist today on television, but they were founded in radio. As was a third network, CBS. CBS, founded by William Paley, he owned a cigar company, the Columbia Cigar Company. He just wanted a way to advertise his cigars, so he founded a whole radio network called CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System, in 1928. Now let's talk about the transition from radio to television. Radio had its golden age in the 1920s through the 1940s. That was radio's prime time. There was no other technology around that was capturing the attention and interests of listeners, audience members across the United States. Every house had a living room with a radio set behind the couch. Families would gather around, listen to radio at night. And so this was radio's golden age. You had the best talent in radio, the biggest advertising dollars. And the content that you would hear was tremendously various. You could find mysteries, soap operas, westerns, sci-fi, variety shows, sports. One of the very first sports broadcasts was commentating a Rose Bowl match, a Rose Bowl game, college football. And so radio had its golden years in the 1920s to the 1940s. And in fact, here at East Stroudsburg University, we have what's known as a vintage radio hour, which we air on WESS radio, which is the MTV Woody Award-winning radio station. Yeah, did you know that? Did you know East Stroudsburg has a radio station that won the MTV Woody Award? What's the Woody Award? It's for being the best college radio station in the whole country. The whole country want it. We want it right here. And one of the reasons is because we offer programming like the Vintage Radio Hour from 9 to 10 o'clock every morning during weekdays, and we air these classic radio programs. Unfortunately, one of the most popular classic radio programs, which also went over to television when television came on the scene, was Amos and Andy. And as part of my teaching ethic, it's very important to me that I help to try and expose systematic racism when we see it in the media, as we try to achieve equality and justice for all ethnicities, but in this case, African Americans, because Amos and Andy was a comedy show, but the actors were white, dressed up as black people. They used to darken their skin, and they used to imitate black people in the most condescending and ridiculing way. That's how they made black humor supposedly appealing to people who listened at the time. It was the most important radio show. You could hear it in restaurants, gas stations, Amos and Andy, and it's gone now, thankfully. But we need to point that out. Next up, I want to talk about television. It came on the scene in the 1950s. It actually was developed in the 40s, but people started buying TV sets in the 50s. It takes a while for technology to be affordable, right? And as soon as television started to grow in popularity, all of the content on radio moved over. It vanished. It migrated. The best actors, the advertisers, they went over to television. Radio's left holding the bag now. What's going to happen? And eventually, radio did come back. It reinvented itself in the late 50s and the early 60s as a niche medium. Do you know that word, niche medium? Has a narrow focus, radio now. That's why you have radio stations that are just rock stations, just country stations, just hip-hop stations, although they're harder to find because of the problem of profanity. But you have radio now that's focused not on capturing the big audience that's out there, children, adults, men, women. No, radio goes for very specific audiences now with its format programming. That's the way that radio is referred to. It's format programming. It has a radio format like rock, for example. The biggest company today is the iHeart Media Company. There was a law that was passed in 1996 called the Telecommunications Act. And similar to a lot of other themes in this class, what it allowed for was more radio stations to be owned by fewer companies. So fewer companies, just like every other media industry that we've talking about, they control the content. And iHeartMedia happens to be the biggest company. And they have several radio stations in the Lehigh Valley. They've got WZZO. They've got WAEB, which is a news station. WZZO is a rock station. They've got B104, which is a soft rock station. iHeartMedia, as a parent company, has about 850 radio stations. Another development that we had to push radio along is the development of streaming. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but you've got terrestrial radio, right? That's radio signals that go from a transmitter to your antenna, like in your car, in your radio receiver. That's terrestrial radio. It has to go through the airwaves. You've got satellite radio. Satellite radio comes to you from Sirius Radio in New York City, and comes from a bird in the sky, as we say, down to your satellite receiver. We've got HD radio, which is high definition radio, just like we have on television. We've high definition television has more clarity to it. That can only come on satellite radio or internet radio. And then lastly, we have streaming radio. Streaming radio coming from Pandora, which started in 2004, and Spotify and other streaming companies are out there. So streaming is just another expression of audio. It's another form of radio, if you want to think of. And then we have podcasting as well. Podcasting, very important. Jake Paul pushing podcasting to the masses of young people, getting people interested in podcasting. Apple actually started that with this iPod and the development of iTunes in 2001, which made it possible for you to download music and save it, and also download podcasts. So podcasts today are just simply audio programs that are stored, that are archived, that you can go fetch anytime. They have a lot looser format, right? You can just people sitting around joking. You can have a very loose format for podcasting, but the key is it can be stored and listened to later. Now we're going to move on to the subject of how music has affected youth and culture and society. That's what we're going to move to now. And at the core of music, youth, and society is usually the format called rock and roll, that kind of music. And the solid body guitar, the same guitar that you saw Stevie Ray Vaughan playing at the very beginning of the instructor video, that solid body guitar allowed music to be amplified and played for somebody who's sitting way over there. They don't have to be sitting in the same room. They can be sitting on the other side of a football stadium and hear you if you're playing a solid body guitar. And some of the first musicians to play the solid body guitar were black musicians in the South playing rhythm and blues. They started to play this guitar and amplify it and try different sounds, mostly with rhythm and blues, not R&B like you think about today in the rap or hip hop genre, but rhythm and blues was played by actually African Americans who were in cotton fields, and that's the way that they were speaking to each other and getting through the day and communicating with each other. That's where that musical form comes from. So rhythm and blues starts to push radio as well. But the problem is we had racism at the level of people in the United States not accepting black musicians playing music on the radio. And so early black musicians like Wynonie Harris in 1947, he recorded this song called Good Rockin' Tonight. You can see the link in the email that I sent you. It became a big hit on jukeboxes, but not as big as it could have become because people still had that racist barrier to listening to black musicians. So that paves the way in our culture for Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley comes along because he's an acceptable person, or at least so the industry thought. He's an acceptable person because he's white, and he can sing black songs. That's what Elvis Presley was doing. That's how he became famous. He was singing black music for the most part. And he didn't even write his songs, Elvis Presley, but he had a way of performing. You can see him performing. He was known as Elvis the Pelvis. He was the first one to have a sexual dance style to the way that he performed. Cameras weren't even allowed to shoot him from the waist down, according to societal standards at that time, because his hips were too sexual. Okay. Thankfully, though, a black musician was able to break through and become popular nationwide. A black rock and roll musician named Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry playing a solid body guitar. He had this famous walk that he did called the duck walk. When he played the guitar, goes walking across the stage with the duck walk. He brought rock and roll to the masses, and he also brought it onto radio. And so radio DJs started to become really big, important people, just like DJs are important today, or party DJs. They have a certain status to them, entertainment status. Two of the big ones were Alan Freed, F-R-E-E-D, Alan Freed, and Dewey Phillips. Dewey Phillips playing rock and roll. They were as popular as the musicians, these DJs. Now let's talk about how music itself has changed, pop music specifically, because popular music is music for the masses. And the only way music gets to the masses is because of radio and recording, right? So the massification of music took place because of these technologies that we're talking about today. And so the first music we want to highlight is Motown. Motown, named for Motor Town, or Detroit, where cars are made. That's where Motown's coming from. Motown Records was founded by an African American. His name was Berry Gordy, and he wanted to have a record label where blacks could perform black written music instead of having to perform white music or white people performing black music. We had a record label that was for black people. And this also paralleled civil rights, the movements towards civil rights in the late 1960s. Some of the most famous Motown artists are Marvin Gaye and the Supremes. The Supremes, big ones. Next up is a genre we call the British Invasion. The British Invasion is all these bands coming over from Britain. It's sort of my time period when I was a kid, a little bit later than, my time period was a little bit later, but the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Hollies, the Who, the Kinks. These are all bands that came over. They were dominating American radio. British bands dominating American radio. In the 1970s, music started to become performed more popularly in live shows. Live shows started to take on costuming and sets. I mean, some of the last times I saw the Rolling Stones, they had fireworks and pyrotechnics going off on the stage. And you've seen bands with all kinds of lighting effects too. That started to grow in importance in the 1970s. As did concept albums. That's another kind of music that grew. Concept albums, or LPs, are albums that would have a theme to them across the entire collection of songs on side A and the entire collection of songs on side B. There were various concept albums. Probably the most famous one is Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. That album spent 741 weeks. 741 weeks. There's 56 weeks in a year. 741 weeks on Billboard's top 200 album chart. So that album really had legs. In the 1970s, stereo gets developed as a method of delivering audio sound. And so now you're breaking up a song into two channels. That's why you have headphones. We have two ears, and those two channels are carrying different parts of the song. It makes it much more easy to listen to, and it makes it easier to layer music, to record drums, and then come back and record a bass, and then come back and record vocals, and then come back and record harmonic or sampling, as hip hop is done today. That's stereo is paved the way for that kind of recording technique. Next genre we want to talk about is hip hop. Hip hop is more than just music, right? It's DJing, it's dancing, it's rapping, and it's art. It's all of those things together. It began supposedly in 1974. Hip hop did, when DJ Kook Herc, he invented the break beat on the streets of Harlem. You know what I'm talking about. And so hip hop grew up in urban areas of the country. It was a way mainly for African Americans early on to express themselves, to have competitions with each other, to find a public space within a very dense population of a city and have a place to play and express themselves. And so hip hop, or rap as it's also sometimes known, even though hip hop refers more to clothing style, it started to grow up, and it includes emceeing. That's speaking speaking words. That's what rapping is. It's speaking the words, not singing them, over music. So it includes emceeing, it includes DJing. That's using recorded music from multiple sources. So you're sampling, you're grabbing. Early on, you were scratching with the album, and then bringing in other people's songs. So it's got that as well. It's got emceeing, it's got DJing, it's got b-boying. B-boying is physical movement and dance styles and dance-offs, dancing, physical movement, and it's got graffiti art, which is visual images of culture grid, spray paint, and other kinds of graffiti art. The next music form we want to talk about is country music. It's actually the most popular music format in the United States. If you look at all the music formats on radio, country is the most popular when you get outside of the city. In the city, it's news and talk. But country music was born in the early 1900s, believe it or not. It came up from Scottish folk music. A lot of Scottish people came to the United States. They came to West Virginia and the Appalachians. They went to Tennessee, and Irish and Scottish folk music. Then it mixed in with Mississippi blues, and then Christian gospel music, which was formerly hillbilly music. All of these forms together into country. And country for the longest time was just in the south of the United States, and it had twangy guitars like a Hank Williams and Johnny Cash. That was Conway Twitty. That's the way that country music was until MTV came along, and MTV made country music visual. Country music then used the best-looking stars, what we would consider today to be the Faith Hills, for example, the best-looking stars, and the Shania Twains, and people who had visual look, and MTV took country and spread it to the rest of the country, but also country started to adopt sounds from rock and roll, started to adopt guitars. Garth Brooks, one of the biggest country stars to start to make his country songs sound less twangy, still country, but a little bit more like rock and roll with the guitars, and that's when country became so popular across the country. Now we're going to move to the subject of concerns about the effects of music on young people. There's always concerns. I can remember for the longest time, Ozzy Osbourne was blamed for suicides in this country because of his song Suicide Solution. But the fact is that music is looked at as having negative influences. Rap is looked at for drugs. It's looked at for misogyny. Do you know that word? It's the mistreatment of women. It's looked at as glamorizing gangs. That's what rap is looked at sometimes in a negative light. Same thing has happened to rock and roll, especially with drug use. I mean, Jimi Hendrix, Purple Haze, it's a song about an acid trip. Even the Beatles, the so-called goody-goody band, they're writing Strawberry Fields Forever. This is a song about marijuana. And so the question is, do people take up those behaviors because they hear about it in songs, and do they take up those behaviors too early in life, like when they're kids? I mean, is that what happened to Stevie Ray Vaughan with a cocaine and whiskey addiction? That's for you to decide, but it's a debate that takes place. All right, now we're going to move to the future of radio, the future of audio, which, like the other technologies, is difficult to predict. We do know that podcasting is going to continue to grow. Podcasting is something that anybody can do. You can make your own podcast. Some of you maybe started a podcast in the pandemic as a way to break out of the confinement that you're into. So we know that podcast is going to be in the future. We also know that subscription music is also representing a growth area as well. We're talking about Spotify, Amazon, Tidal, Apple, Pandora, subscribing to music and being able to receive it. We also know that streaming is going to be in the future. That's the way that people receive music today. As long as you have an internet connection, you can go find any kind of music that you want. So those are the things we do know about music. We don't know how profitable it's going to be. It's said today that if you're a music artist, it's impossible to make music by selling your music because it can be gotten for free so easily. The way you make music is by having live performances and getting people to buy tickets. That's the world that we're in the world of audio, the world of sound. Have a great day.